In the cold silence of the Appalachian woods, where the fog moves like breath and time forgets to pass, there once lived a woman no one truly knew. Locals called her Eliza Whittaker, a name whispered more than spoken, often with a hint of fear, as if uttering it might summon something that still lingered in the trees. She came to the mountains sometime in the 1930s, carrying with her a wagon full of broken furniture, a few children with hollow eyes, and a story she never told. No one knew where she came from, only that she stayed deep in the valley where sunlight barely reached and the earth smelled of damp secrets. For years, the townspeople would spot smoke rising from her chimney but never dared to approach. Those who tried never returned the same. Some claimed the Whittakers had their own language, others said they spoke none at all. The mother's face, seen once at a distance, was described as both young and ancient, etched by years of fear and something darker, as if she had carried her own curse into the wilderness. The forest kept her secret well. But time, like rot, finds a way through even the thickest wood. And decades later, when curious men with cameras and flashlights wandered those forgotten paths, they found what remained of Eliza's home, a ruin filled with whispers, bones, and traces of a family that should have never existed. What they uncovered there was not just a story of isolation, but of a mother's desperate attempt to preserve what should have been buried with her, the bloodline of the Whittakers. In the earliest years of the 20th century, when America was still divided by class, silence, and superstition, a woman named Eliza Whittaker appeared at the edge of a forgotten Appalachian hollow. No one knew where she came from. Some said she had fled a cruel husband, others whispered she had escaped from something darker, something that still followed her through the trees. She arrived with a rickety wagon, 2 thin children, and a look in her eyes that told of miles walked without rest. The air around her seemed heavy, like the world had already given up on her. She didn't speak much, not even when the townsfolk offered her food or help. She refused to give her last name at first, but when pressed by the local preacher, she muttered it quietly, Whittaker, and the sound of it settled in people's minds like dust that wouldn't blow away. Eliza chose a place no one wanted. Deep in the holler, miles from the nearest road, she found a patch of ground surrounded by gnarled trees and the sound of running water. There, she built her cabin with her own hands, cutting logs and laying stone until smoke finally rose from a crooked chimney. For the few who saw it, the sight of that smoke curling into the gray sky felt eerie, as if something unnatural had taken root where only silence belonged. Over time, her presence became less human and more like a rumor, spoken about but never confirmed. The locals began calling her the widow in the woods, though no one had ever seen a husband or a grave. She rarely came to town, and when she did, her children clung to her skirts and stared blankly at everyone who tried to greet them. They spoke in broken sentences, like they had learned words from echoes. People noticed how they all had the same pale skin and sunken eyes, features that didn't seem to belong to any of the nearby families. They said the mother watched everyone too closely, as if measuring them, as if weighing the danger of being seen. Then, one winter, she stopped coming to town entirely. The path to her cabin grew over, and the stories about her turned darker. Some said she had found something in those woods, something that made her stay. Others believed she had gone mad from loneliness and built a life that didn't need the outside world. Whatever truth existed vanished with her footsteps into the fog, and the hollow kept its silence, guarding the beginning of what would become America's most isolated bloodline. As years passed in the quiet valley where Eliza Whittaker had made her home, the hollow grew darker in reputation. Travelers and wanderers often cut through those Appalachian trails, seeking shortcuts or logging paths that led between mining towns. But when their routes crossed near the Whittaker land, strange stories began to emerge. The first to vanish was a tinker who roamed the hills fixing tools for scraps of food. He was last seen walking toward the woods where Eliza lived, his pack heavy with pots and pans that jingled faintly in the distance. When spring came, his belongings were found by the creek, rusted and scattered, but no sign of him remained. People said maybe he lost his footing in the river or wandered too far into the hills, yet there was something unsettling in the way his tracks simply stopped, as if the earth had swallowed him whole. Then came the hunters. 2 brothers who knew those woods better than anyone entered the hollow one November morning and never returned. Their hounds came back 3 days later, limping, their coats streaked with mud and something that looked too dark to be dirt. Search parties followed, calling their names into the empty ridges, But the only answer that came was the echo of their own voices. When the sheriff questioned Eliza, she said little, only that she had heard no one and seen nothing. Yet her eyes, they said, seemed to flicker with something that wasn't grief or fear, but quiet knowing. After that, no one went near the Whittaker place. Children dared each other to walk to the edge of the woods but never passed the first row of trees. Old folks said the air there didn't feel right, that even the birds refused to nest near her clearing. The locals began to believe the land itself was cursed. Some claimed to see lights moving through the forest at night, others swore they heard voices, faint and desperate, carried by the wind. The name Whittaker Hollow became one to avoid, a place mothers used to warn their children about when the sun dipped too low. Years turned to decades, and the stories deepened like roots in the soil. People forgot who Eliza had been, only that she lived in a place where the living and the lost seemed to blur together. The disappearances stopped once no one dared to enter anymore, but the fear remained, preserved in whispers and warnings, in the way travelers would quicken their steps when passing by that stretch of forest where the smoke from Eliza's chimney once rose. As time moved on and generations shifted in the nearby Appalachian towns, the Whittaker name began to fade from common memory, yet the hollow where Eliza had once lived never lost its uneasy reputation. In the 1930s, when census takers and government agents were sent deeper into rural areas to record families for aid programs, they came across something that didn't fit their records at all. They heard whispers about a family living in the hills, strange, reclusive, and untouched by time, but when they tried to document them, there were no traces to be found. No marriage licenses, no birth certificates, no school attendance, no death records. It was as though the Whittakers did not legally exist. The officials hiked for days trying to find their cabin, guided only by old stories from locals who hadn't seen Eliza or her children in years. When they reached the place they believed to be her land, all they found was the rotting remains of a wooden house half swallowed by the forest. Inside, there were signs of life long ended: a rusted kettle, a few decayed chairs, the faint outline of a family photograph on the wall where the image itself had faded away. But there were no graves, no personal papers, nothing that tied the Whittakers to the world outside. The census men returned baffled, their reports noting that the occupants are believed to exist but remain unverified. The county clerk dismissed it as superstition, yet one of the surveyors refused to go back. He claimed that on his last day in the hollow, he heard voices whispering through the trees and saw footprints in the mud that didn't belong to anyone in his group. Years later, genealogists trying to trace mountain lineages found the same gaps. There were no Whittakers in birth records before or after Eliza, no trace of her family name in any church or county document. It was as though the family had appeared out of nowhere and then deliberately erased themselves from existence. Even when researchers compared DNA from isolated mountain families decades later, the samples hinted at a lineage that didn't branch outward, it folded in on itself, looping back through generations of the same blood. Locals began to believe that Eliza had wanted it that way. They said she had turned her back on the world deliberately, cutting off her descendants from everything beyond those trees. The Whittakers became ghosts in paper form, people who had lived, breathed, and died, but left no trace in the records of man. Their existence lingered only in memory, in half-told stories, and in the quiet space between fact and myth where the truth of their bloodline still hides. As rumors of the Whittaker family spread through the surrounding Appalachian towns, people began to notice something unsettling about those few who claimed to have glimpsed them. The rare travelers or hunters who ventured close enough to see the family spoke of faces that looked strangely similar, as if carved from the same mold. Their eyes carried the same pale hue, their features almost identical in an unnatural way that made strangers uneasy. Children who saw them from afar described them as ghost people, quiet and expressionless, moving in slow, deliberate motions as though time worked differently for them. These stories spread quickly, transforming curiosity into dread. The idea took hold that what lived in those woods was not a family that had been forgotten, but one that had forgotten the world. The whispers soon grew darker. People began to say that the Whittakers' isolation had gone too far, that somewhere in the generations after Eliza, the family had turned inward in more ways than one. No one married out of the hollow, no one brought new blood into their line. Some believed it began as a way to survive, a desperate attempt to hold on to their family when outsiders refused to approach. But as the decades passed, that isolation twisted into something unrecognizable. The children of the Hollow began to look more and more alike, and the old stories of curses and punishments began to feel less like folklore and more like warnings come true. Farmers who lived miles away claimed they sometimes heard strange cries at night, the kind that didn't sound quite human. A few locals swore they saw figures watching from the tree line, thin, pale shapes that disappeared the moment they were noticed. Whenever anyone tried to investigate, the forest seemed to turn them around, leading them back the way they came as though it refused to let them in. The Whittaker Hollow became a place spoken of only in low voices, a border between the living and something else entirely. Even in nearby churches, preachers began to use the Whittakers as examples in their sermons, warning against the sin of pride and the dangers of isolation. But beneath the moral lessons and ghost stories, one truth remained the same: no one really knew what was happening deep in that forest. The idea of the forbidden lineage became a legend whispered across generations, a reminder that sometimes, when families shut themselves away from the world, the blood remembers, and it doesn't always forgive. Before her death, Eliza Whittaker became something of a myth among the people who lived on the edge of the mountains. No one could say for sure how long she had been there, but by the time whispers of her final years began to spread, her cabin was already overgrown, swallowed by vines and fog. Those who claimed to have seen her in her last days spoke of a woman who seemed neither alive nor gone, her face hollowed by time, her voice carrying the weight of something she had kept buried for far too long. It was said that she knew her end was near, and in those final nights, she gathered her children and their children around the dying fire. The forest outside was silent, the kind of stillness that feels like listening, and in that silence, she made them swear an oath that would shape the Whittaker name for generations. She told them never to leave the Hollow, never to speak to outsiders, never to step beyond the creek that marked the border of their land. She warned them that the world beyond the trees would not understand them, that it would destroy everything she had tried to protect. Some believed she was afraid that the truth about her family would come to light, others thought she had convinced herself that her bloodline carried something sacred that must never be diluted. Whatever the reason, her children obeyed her. They had grown up knowing nothing else, raised on stories that painted the outside world as a place of cruelty and betrayal. The woods were their home, their shield, and their prison. When Eliza finally passed, her body was never buried in a churchyard. Instead, her children laid her to rest beneath a cedar tree near the edge of the hollow, covering her grave with stones and wildflowers. After that day, no one from the family was ever seen again in the nearby towns. The path that once led to their cabin disappeared under moss and fallen branches, as though the earth itself wanted to keep them hidden. Over the years, the oath became less a promise and more a curse. Generations later, when outsiders tried to trace the family, they found nothing but the same faces repeating through time, the same pale eyes staring from the shadows, bound by a vow that had outlived its purpose. Eliza's words had become the law of their blood, echoing through every life that followed her, ensuring that the Whittakers would remain exactly as she had commanded, alone, unseen, and untouched by the world beyond the woods. Decades after Eliza Whittaker's name had faded into rumor, the forest that once hid her became a forgotten corner of the Appalachians, dense, overgrown, and avoided even by hunters. The world had changed beyond recognition. Roads were paved, towns expanded, but that hollow remained untouched, as if frozen in another time. One autumn afternoon, a group of hikers wandered farther than they intended, drawn by the eerie quiet that blanketed the valley. The air felt different there, heavier, carrying a stillness that made even the sound of their footsteps seem wrong. When they reached the heart of the woods, they stumbled upon what looked like the skeleton of a home, rotting beams, a half-collapsed chimney, and fragments of glass glinting weakly in the pale light. It was the Whittaker cabin, or what was left of it. Nature had reclaimed almost everything, yet what remained spoke volumes. The wooden walls, blackened by time, were etched with strange carvings, symbols, words, and handprints that looked too deliberate to be random. Some resembled circles crossed with lines, others were simple initials repeated again and again, as if someone had been trying to remember their own name. Inside the cabin, the floor was scattered with remnants of a life long gone, a rusted cooking pot, a torn quilt, the corner of an old photograph showing faces too faded to identify. When one of the hikers lifted it to the light, the faint image of a woman could be seen, standing among children whose features looked hauntingly similar. The expressions were blank, almost fearful, as though they hadn't known the picture was being taken. The air inside the cabin felt colder than outside, and there was an unmistakable scent of decay mixed with something sweet, like wilted flowers. On the walls, someone had scrawled words in chalk or ash, most of them unreadable, except for one that still stood clear, *stay. Beneath it, the hikers found a crude wooden cross, half buried under the dirt, suggesting that someone had once tried to sanctify the space or protect it. The group left quickly, disturbed by a sense that they were not alone, that the forest was watching. When they told the locals what they had found, few believed them. Those who did simply nodded and warned them not to go back. The cabin, they said, had been there longer than anyone could remember. Some claimed that every few decades, the woods gave up a piece of the Whittaker story, only to swallow it again. The hikers' discovery became another whisper in a long chain of unsolved mysteries, proof that the past, no matter how deeply buried, never truly lets go. Years after the hikers stumbled upon the remains of the Whittaker cabin, a local historian returned to the site, determined to uncover whatever truth still lingered beneath the rot and silence. The discovery that followed began with a half-buried metal box found near the foundation of the old chimney. Inside, protected by layers of cloth gone brittle with age, were several torn and yellowed pages, fragments of what appeared to be a woman's journal. The handwriting was uneven, slanted as though written by trembling hands, and the ink had bled from years of moisture. Most of the words were unreadable, but the ones that remained told of a life spent in fear, isolation, and guilt. Scholars who later studied the writings believed them to be Eliza Whittaker's own voice, her final confession to a secret too heavy to take to the grave. The pages painted a haunting picture. Eliza wrote about hearing whispers outside her cabin long after, dark voices calling her name in tones both familiar and unearthly. She wrote of children born two alike, of sickness that came without reason, and of dreams filled with the faces of those she had lost. One passage described a shadow by the creek that she believed was watching her family, punishing them for what she called the sin of the blood. There were hints that Eliza had made choices she came to regret deeply, choices to keep her family hidden even when it meant cutting them off from everything human. She wrote of her fear that leaving the hollow would bring ruin, and staying would bring something worse. The final pages were nearly illegible, the words smudged by what looked like tears or rain. What could still be read spoke of repentance, of a woman who believed she had damned her children by obeying her own pride. "I kept them too close," one line read, "and now they are no longer mine, but the woods." Those who examined the journal later said the tone shifted near the end, her fear turned to acceptance, as if she knew her family's fate was sealed long before her death. When news of the diary spread, it reignited local legends and drew outsiders eager to uncover more. But each search ended the same way, with the forest reclaiming what was disturbed, trails fading overnight, and evidence vanishing as quickly as it appeared. The diary was all that remained, a trembling voice from a woman lost to time, speaking from the edge of madness and sorrow, revealing just enough to make the truth more terrifying than silence ever was. Decades after Eliza Whittaker's supposed diary was found, the story of her family might have remained a local ghost tale if not for a team of researchers from a nearby university who began studying genetic isolation in remote Appalachian communities. Their work, rooted in science rather than folklore, led them deep into the same mountain regions where the Whittakers were said to have lived. Collecting samples from small, nearly forgotten settlements, they stumbled upon something that didn't fit the patterns of ordinary genetic drift. Several samples showed a degree of similarity that defied logic, markers that were too closely aligned, repeating across generations as if the same bloodline had circled back on itself countless times. When cross-referenced with historical maps and oral histories, the data pointed toward one secluded valley, the very region long associated with the Whittaker name. At first, the researchers dismissed the coincidence. But as they dug deeper, they realized that no official records existed for anyone living there. The surnames changed, but the genes did not. The people in that area shared physical traits so distinct they seemed inherited from a single, unbroken ancestry. Local elders refused to speak about it, their silence heavy with something more than fear. It was protection. They claimed no knowledge of any Whittakers, yet they warned the outsiders to leave the valley alone, insisting that some roots are better left buried. One researcher described an unsettling feeling while collecting data there, as though being watched from the trees. Another reported that his equipment malfunctioned every time he got close to the heart of the hollow. When the genetic results were finally compiled, the findings were disturbing enough to draw attention from national institutions. The report suggested that one isolated bloodline in Appalachia had remained genetically self-contained for almost a century, untouched by external ancestry. While the names of participants were withheld, the descriptions matched the area known to locals as the Old Whittaker Ground. Soon after, the lead researcher who had organized the study resigned unexpectedly, and much of the data was quietly sealed. Some claimed the university buried the results to avoid public controversy, others believed the truth was too unsettling to confront. The revelation breathed new life into the legend, giving scientific weight to what had once been dismissed as folklore. People began to question whether Eliza's oath to keep her bloodline pure had succeeded in ways no one could have imagined. The idea that her descendants still lived unchanged, unseen, and carrying the same marks of isolation in their very DNA became the most haunting proof that her story was never just a myth, but a living echo of a choice made long ago in the shadows of the Appalachian woods. Hidden deep in the dense Appalachian wilderness, far beyond the reach of paved roads and satellite signals, small groups of people still live as though time stopped a century ago. Locals call them the Hollow Folk, but old stories whisper another name, the Whittakers. For decades, hikers, hunters, and journalists have claimed to have seen them, or at least traces of their presence. The faint glow of lamplight through the trees, soft murmurs in an unknown dialect, and wooden symbols carved into trunks like warnings or prayers. Most who venture close never find the people themselves, only signs that someone is still there, surviving quietly in the ruins of what once was Eliza Whittaker's domain. Those who say they have glimpsed them describe figures moving cautiously between the trees, pale faces, sunken eyes, clothes made of stitched rags and animal skins. They live without electricity, without running water, without any visible connection to the world beyond the woods. It's said they have their own form of speech, a language born from isolation and decay, made of broken English mixed with something older, something incomprehensible. Some believe they no longer remember where their family began or how the world outside even works. Generations of solitude have created a life that is both peaceful and haunting, a community existing entirely apart, suspended between civilization and extinction. Occasionally, someone stumbles upon their trails, narrow paths marked with bones or hanging branches. Cameras malfunction there, compasses spin, and those who stay too long often describe a feeling of being followed, though no footsteps echo behind them. A few lost hikers have reported waking to find food left beside their campfire, as if watched over by unseen hosts who want neither contact nor harm, only distance. But there are darker accounts too, strange sounds at night, figures appearing at the edge of vision, and in rare cases, people disappearing altogether. Researchers and documentary filmmakers who attempt to verify these sightings always return with the same conclusion: the Whittaker descendants, if they still exist, are not interested in being found. Their continued isolation seems deliberate, as though the oath Eliza once made still governs their lives. The forest protects them, concealing their cabins beneath layers of mist and memory. Some say they are the last living remnant of an era the world has chosen to forget, others insist they are proof that certain bloodlines refuse to fade, no matter how deep they bury themselves. Whatever truth remains, it hides behind the trees, guarded by silence and the ghosts of a promise made generations ago. Years after researchers and hikers first began uncovering traces of the Whittakers, a small independent film crew set out to document what they believed was the final untold story of America's most isolated family. They arrived with modern equipment, satellite maps, and weeks' worth of supplies, convinced that the truth behind the legend could finally be revealed. Their plan was to explore the area where the old Whittaker cabin once stood and capture interviews with locals who still whispered about the bloodline in hushed tones. At first, everything went as expected. The crew recorded hours of footage, documenting abandoned paths, forgotten grave markers, and fragments of decaying structures swallowed by the forest. But the deeper they moved into the hollow, the stranger things became. The sound equipment began to pick up faint voices when no one was speaking, whispers layered beneath the static like echoes of distant conversations. At night, the cameras captured fleeting movements between the trees, shapes too fast and too blurred to be human. One crew member claimed to have heard someone calling his name from the woods, though no one else had spoken. The air itself felt thicker, colder, as if the forest was closing around them, erasing the line between past and present. After the fourth night, they stopped receiving satellite signals altogether. The GPS marked their position as blank space. On the fifth day, one of the crew members vanished while retrieving batteries from their van. His flashlight was found still burning in the grass, but no tracks led away. The others searched until nightfall, their fear now replacing curiosity. The following morning, their tent had been torn open, though none of their equipment was missing. The remaining team decided to leave, but as they tried to retrace their path, the trails they had followed before were gone, replaced by dense undergrowth as if the forest had shifted overnight. Weeks later, park rangers found only fragments of their belongings scattered miles apart: shredded notebooks, broken lenses, and a camera with a few minutes of corrupted footage still intact. The final scene showed the team walking through the trees as the light faded, then a sudden, jarring cut to darkness. A single frame lingered before the footage ended, a pale figure standing behind them, watching. The film was never released, and the incident was quietly buried under reports of lost hikers. To this day, only pieces of the recovered footage circulate among collectors of unsolved mysteries, each claiming to have seen something different in those last few seconds: a face, a shadow, or the faint outline of the Whittaker legacy staring back from the woods.